Welcome to Libyth. Everything we've covered so far in this series has been, in a sense, preparation for the part of the Kogo Shūi that actually constitutes its climax. Not a climax in the dramatic sense, since this text has no plot to build toward a turning point, but a climax in the argumentative sense, the moment where everything that came before finally cashes out into a concrete claim. That moment is the list of 11 things, the specific grievances Hironari presents to Emperor Hies. Framed as precedents the imperial government has allowed to lapse to the detriment of proper ritual order, and not coincidentally, to the detriment of the Inb clan specifically. Everything about the structure we examined earlier, the genealogy establishing divine descent, the retelling of national history establishing continuity and participation in the central narrative of the imperial line, exists to make this list land with maximum credibility. By the time a reader, or more precisely an emperor receiving this petition, arrives at the 11 grievances, the text has already spent considerable effort establishing that the party making these complaints has serious standing to make them. It's worth thinking carefully about why a list, specifically, is the form this climax takes, rather than a single overarching complaint stated once and elaborated at length. A list of 11 distinct items does something a single grand complaint cannot do nearly as effectively. It accumulates. Each individual item, on its own, might be dismissed as a minor administrative oversight, the kind of small inconsistency that creeps into any long-running ceremonial system over generations of practice. But presented together, as 11 separate instances of the same underlying pattern, they stop reading as isolated oversights and start reading as evidence of a systematic, structural drift, proof that something has gone wrong not in one place, but throughout the entire apparatus of court ritual administration. This is a rhetorical technique that depends on quantity doing work that no single example could do alone. One neglected precedent is an accident. 11 neglected precedents, carefully enumerated and presented in sequence, become a pattern. And a pattern is a far more serious and far more actionable thing to bring before an emperor than any single complaint could ever be on its own. There's also something worth noting about the specific number itself. 11, because it sits at an interesting rhetorical position, large enough to feel comprehensive, to feel like the product of careful, exhaustive documentation rather than a hastily assembled complaint, but not so large that it becomes unwieldy or starts to feel like padding, like grievances being manufactured simply to inflate the count. 11 specific, presumably verifiable points of ritual precedent is the kind of number that signals diligence. It suggests a petitioner who has done the careful work of cataloging exactly what has gone wrong rather than simply venting a generalized sense of grievance. This matters enormously for how the document would have been received at court, because a vague complaint about declining status invites dismissal as mere resentment, while a specific, numbered, presumably checkable list of administrative lapses invites something closer to investigation. Hironari is not asking the emperor to take his word for an abstract injustice. He is presenting something that reads like an audit, and an audit is much harder for a ruling authority to wave away than a complaint, because an audit implies the existence of records against which its claims could, in principle, be verified. What's particularly worth dwelling on is the rhetorical genius of how these 11 grievances are framed, because this is where the text's earlier insistence on restoration rather than innovation does its most important work. At no point does Hironari frame these 11 points as new demands, as a request for some change to the existing order that has never previously existed. Every single one is framed as the neglect of an existing, established, ancient precedent, something that already should be happening, that once did happen, and that has simply been allowed to lapse through carelessness or drift, rather than through any deliberate decision to disadvantage the Inb clan. This framing accomplishes something quite remarkable. It lets Hironari make what amounts to a significant claim for restored status and restored material benefit while presenting himself, the entire time, not as an ambitious petitioner seeking advancement, but as a conscientious guardian of tradition, simply asking that things be put back the way they properly always were. This is, in a sense, the same rhetorical move we saw operating at the level of myth, presenting an aggressive substantive claim through the register of humble correction, now repeated at the level of concrete, specific administrative grievance. The strategy that shaped the entire mythological section of the text reappears, in miniature, in the structure of each individual grievance on this list. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge something that often gets treated as the less interesting part of the Kogo Shūi, but that actually deserves real respect. The material covering the origins of festivals and the proper conduct of rites dedicated to local kami. This is, admittedly, not the part of the text built for dramatic hooks. There's no theological one-upmanship here, no elevation of one god above another, no obvious political subtext waiting to be decoded. What this material offers instead is something quieter, but, in its own way, just as important to the document's overall function: credibility through demonstrated expertise. By including detailed accounts of festival origins and ritual procedure that have no obvious connection to the Inb-Nakatomi rivalry, Hironari is establishing something the more overtly political sections of the text cannot establish on their own: that he, and by extension his clan, possess genuine, detailed, technical mastery over the actual substance of Shinto ritual practice, not merely a political grievance dressed up in religious language. This is the load-bearing material of the document, in the literal architectural sense. It doesn't generate the hooks or the dramatic tension that the genealogical disputes do, but it provides the structural credibility that makes the rest of the document's claims land with greater force. A petitioner who can describe festival origins and ritual minutiae with this level of specific, confident detail is a petitioner who has earned the right to be heard on questions of ritual precedent, because he has demonstrated, independent of any political stake, that he actually knows what he's talking about. This is worth connecting back to the broader question of why the Kogo Shūi survived and continued to be read for so many centuries afterward, well past the point where the original Inb-Nakatomi rivalry had any remaining political stakes for anyone. A document that was purely political grievance, with no independent value as a record of ritual practice and mythological tradition, would likely not have earned the kind of lasting attention this text received. What gave the Kogo Shūi its staying power was precisely this combination: a sharp, self-interested political argument wrapped around a genuine, careful, detailed record of festival origins, ritual procedure, and mythological material, much of it preserved nowhere else in the surviving textual record. Later readers, including scholars working centuries after the Inb-Nakatomi conflict, had become a matter of pure historical curiosity rather than live political stakes, kept returning to this text, not because they cared who had won an argument about court ritual precedents in the 9th century, but because the document had preserved, almost as a side effect of its political purpose, genuine pieces of historical and religious knowledge unavailable anywhere else. The grievance got the document written. The festival material, is part of what kept it read. There's a final dimension to this material worth raising, because it connects the seemingly dry content about festival origins back to the larger argument the entire text has been building from its opening pages. Recall that one of the deepest currents running through the Kogo Shūi is the claim that the Inbi clan represents the last faithful keepers of an oral tradition that the rest of the court has begun to neglect and forget. The detailed material on festival origins and proper ritual conduct functions as direct, concrete proof of that larger claim. It is not enough, rhetorically, for Hironari to simply assert that his clan remembers what others have forgotten. He needs to demonstrate it, and the festival material is exactly that demonstration. That the official record, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, however authoritative they had become, were never complete, and that completing them required exactly the kind of inherited, oral, clan-specific memory that only a house like the Inb still possessed. The grievance about the 11 neglected things asks the emperor to restore something. The festival material quietly demonstrates why the Inb clan, of all the houses at court, are the ones qualified to be the ones asking. It's worth pressing further into what the 11 grievances actually consist of in substance, because the texture of these specific complaints matters for understanding why this particular form of argument was so well suited to the case Hironari was making. These are not complaints about grand theological status or sweeping claims to divine favor. They are granular, procedural, almost bureaucratic in character. Disputes over which offerings should be directed to which shrines, over which ceremonial implements should be prepared by which clan, over specific points of precedent governing how particular rites ought to be conducted and by whom. This granularity is itself a rhetorical choice, and a shrewd one. A grand theological grievance invites a grand theological response, the kind of response that risks reopening exactly the sensitive question of relative divine status that the mythological sections of the text had already worked so carefully to settle in the Inbi clan's favor, without stating it as a direct claim. A granular procedural grievance, by contrast, invites a much narrower and more manageable kind of response. A clerk checking precedent, an official confirming or adjusting a specific practice, the ordinary machinery of court administration doing what it already does in countless other contexts. By keeping the explicit content of his grievances at this procedural level, even while the mythological framing surrounding them does much bolder work beneath the surface, Hironari makes his petition easy to grant without it ever looking like the emperor is conceding anything of grand consequence. The boldness lives in the myth. The ask on the surface stays modest and specific. There's a further point worth drawing out about how these 11 items function once they're read alongside each other rather than treated as 11 isolated complaints. Several of them concern the proper preparation and handling of the sacred regalia and ritual implements, precisely the domain that had always been the Inb clan's hereditary specialty. The half of the ritual partnership the Nakatomi had never formally held responsibility for. This is not incidental. By concentrating his specific grievances on the domain where his own clan's expertise was least contestable, Hironari ensures that every individual item on the list plays directly to his own house's recognized competence, rather than wandering into territory where his standing to comment might be more easily questioned. A complaint about liturgical wording, the Nakatomi's traditional domain, would have invited the obvious rejoinder that the Inb clan had no particular authority to judge such matters. A complaint about the condition or treatment of the sacred mirror, the jewels, the regalia, items the Inb clan had handled for generations, carries an automatic credibility that needs no separate defense. The 11 things, read this way, are not simply a list of grievances. They are a carefully selected set of grievances, chosen specifically from the area where the petitioner's authority to complain was least vulnerable to challenge. It's also worth considering how this final section of the text would have been received by an audience attuned, as any high-end court audience would have been, to the broader genre conventions of petition literature more generally. Petitions to the throne were not a novelty in this period. They were a recognized and fairly common feature of court life, governed by their own implicit rules about acceptable tone, acceptable scope, and acceptable degrees of specificity. A petition that overreached, that asked for too much or framed its request too aggressively, risked being read as presumptuous, an overstepping of the petitioner's proper place. A petition that underreached, that buried its actual request so deeply in deferential language that the request itself became hard to locate, risked simply being ignored or misunderstood. A much harder position to defend than simply granting a request, framed as restoration of something that should never have lapsed in the first place. Consider, finally, what this final section tells us about the broader afterlife of the Kogo Shūi as a document that continued to matter long after its immediate political context had dissolved. The 11 things, as specific administrative grievances tied to 9th century court politics, eventually became irrelevant in the most literal sense. The particular ritual arrangements they describe, the particular balance of power between the Inb and Nakatomi clans they were attempting to correct, ceased to carry any live stakes once the political world that produced them had moved on. And yet the document did not become irrelevant along with its original context, because the structure built around those 11 things, the genealogy, the national history, the careful rhetorical strategy of restoration rather than innovation, retained value entirely independent of whether anyone still cared who controlled which ritual function at the high-end court. This is, in the end, the most durable achievement of the text's structure. By building its argument out of material with multiple layers of value, mythological, historical, linguistic, and rhetorical, Hironari produced a document whose usefulness did not depend on the survival of the specific grievance that motivated it. The petition could become a historical curiosity. The argument built to support it remained a genuine achievement of rhetorical and structural craft, worth studying on its own terms by readers who could not have cared less, 12 centuries later, about the proper handling of court regalia in the early 9th century. Put together, what you have in this final section of the text is the place where every thread the Kogo Shūi has been weaving throughout its length finally converges into something close to a complete case. The political grievance, sharpened into 11 specific, numbered, audit-like points. The rhetorical strategy of restoration rather than innovation, repeated here at the level of concrete administrative detail after having already done its work at the level of cosmic myth. And underneath both of those, the quieter, more patient work of the festival and ritual material, establishing through sheer demonstrated expertise that the party making all these claims has actually earned the standing to make them. In the deep and contested territory of the past. Stepping back from the 11 things and the festival material to take in the whole shape of what this series has covered, what emerges is a portrait of a document that rewards exactly the kind of close, patient attention most viewers would never think to give a 1,000-year-old administrative petition dressed up as scripture. A man losing a slow political war reached for myth as his last available weapon. The social machinery that made that war winnable through ritual standing in the first place left precise, traceable points where formal equality and actual power had drifted apart. The text built its case with the discipline of a legal brief, evidence before claim, narrative before petition, and populated that case with figures functioning less as characters than as positions in a structural argument about who deserved what. Underneath all of it sat a philosophical question about who gets to decide what the past was, a question the text itself never answers and was never going to answer. And here, at the end, the argument finally cashes out into its most concrete form. 11 specific things, asked for in the most careful language available, by a clan that had already spent the rest of the document proving it had the standing to ask. None of this required Hironari to ever once raise his voice. That restraint, sustained across every section of a fairly ambitious and fairly aggressive document, may be the single most impressive thing about the Kogo Shūi proof that the most effective way to contest power is sometimes not to confront it directly at all, but to quietly, patiently, rewrite the story both sides depend on for their place in the world, and then simply wait to see whether anyone is paying close enough attention to notice what's actually being asked for. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.